Good morning. It is truly a joy to be with family today, to be together, to listen to our Father, to listen to His Word together. An average sermon for me consists of somewhere in the realm of 6,000 words. At least if I speak at 150 words per minute for about 40 minutes, that's what it comes out to. And that's a lot. In fact, if I preach just 52 times a year, that comes out to over 300,000 words. Add in Bible classes, and we're very quickly at well over 500,000 words that I'll say from this pulpit in any given year. And my aim in that is that every single one of those words will bring glory to God. But that's intimidating. Communication is hard. As our words go from our brains to our mouths to someone else's ears and into their brains, there's a lot that can go wrong. In fact, there's a lot that can go wrong between my brain and my mouth to begin with, let alone the other parts of that process. And so we need God's help in that. James 3 warns us about the danger of our tongues, and he begins the chapter in James 3 and verse 1 by saying, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment." We need teachers. It's important work that we spend time talking about God's Word. If I wasn't convicted of that, I would probably quit doing this and do something else. But we need a healthy respect for the power of the tongue and the seriousness of using it properly as God intends in teaching, exhorting, building up our brethren, always speaking the truth, and always speaking it in love. And even if you're not a teacher, even if you never sing a single word from this pulpit, it's been estimated that the average person speaks somewhere between 10 and 15,000 words a day. We all have a great responsibility when it comes to our tongues. The second verse of James chapter 3 says, "For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body." James later calls the tongue a restless evil full of deadly poison. We need God's help with our words. We desperately need His help with our tongues. So today I want us to communicate a little bit about communicating. Actually originally prepared 2 lessons on this topic back in Pittsburgh during the beginning stages of COVID, when communication was a very difficult thing, as we were working through some difficult decisions and trying to communicate different perspectives through that at a distance, through mostly electronic communication. I opened up the book of Proverbs and said, okay, what is Proverbs? What does this book of wisdom tell us about our tongue? And I was planning on doing 1 lesson, but it got longer and longer, and so as is often the case for me, I did 2 lessons. We're going to do 2 lessons on 10 rules for communication from the book of Proverbs. We'll look at 5 rules or principles today and 5 next week. What principles does the Bible give us about the proper use of our tongues? How can I be a better speaker? How can I be a better listener on both ends of this process? How can we develop good habits of communication and use it to strengthen our relationship with one another? And so I hope we can all leave today with a little better, being a little bit better equipped to handle the challenges of communication in a way that glorifies God. And the first rule that I want us to consider is very simple. It is communicate. This is kind of like what Proverbs says in Proverbs 4 in verse 7. There it says, "The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom. And whatever you get insight." The beginning of wisdom, get wisdom. We're kind of saying here, the beginning of communication is do it. Proverbs is going to encourage us on the value of communication. As difficult as communication is, it is extremely important. And we need to do it, we need to do it well, and we need to do it consistently. Because communication is what relationships are built on. And so we can't let fear or frustration or hurt feelings or busyness or neglect keep us from reaching out to one another, fostering stronger relationships through communication. The church that works well together is a church that communicates well with one another. Proverbs 18 and verse 21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit." Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. The tongue can do great damage, and we'll talk some about that, but it can also do great good. And those who are going to experience that good are those who love it, those who love the power of the tongue and give it its proper attention. Back in Pittsburgh during the beginning stages of COVID, as we were working through a lot of different issues and trying to communicate through them, I was talking with one of the brothers there, and I kind of tongue-in-cheek said, "I hate communication." And he thought that was kind of funny coming from the preacher. But, it's hard. It's difficult, especially when there's different perspectives and there's misunderstanding. I don't like that. But that's not the attitude that I need to have. And I was wrong in that. Even jokingly, I shouldn't hate communication. I should love it. Because those who love it are those who are going to eat its fruit. We need to see its value, to see its importance. I need to love it and love the good fruit it produces when directed by the Lord. So Proverbs is going to have a lot to say about when not to speak and how not to speak, but we shouldn't get the wrong idea that there is a big difference between simply avoiding bad communication and cultivating good communication. Active communication is essential to build the kind of relationship God wants us to have, and it's especially essential when there is conflict and misunderstanding. We're going to look at two passages from the book of Matthew that talk about our responsibility to communicate where there is some sin or conflict involved. Look with me in Matthew 5. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 and 24, here in the Sermon on the Mount. Starting in verse 23. Here Jesus says, "Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering." Do you see what he says there? If you're making your offering at the altar, if you have come to worship, you have an animal in your hands, you're getting ready to slaughter it, and you realize that your brother has something against you, just drop what you're doing, stop it, and go make that right. We rightly emphasize the importance of the assembly, rightly emphasize the importance of spending time collectively in worship to God. But do you know what God puts more importance on than simply our outward acts of worship here in this building? Here, he says making things right with our brethren, communicating through conflict, reaching reconciliation is more foundational in importance to us being pleasing to the Lord in any outward act of worship that we might give. In fact, if we are in that situation today and we know that there's something that we've done wrong, that somebody is holding against us, Jesus might just say, get up out of the pew, go into the foyer, make a phone call, send a text, compose an email. That's how important it is. And I'm not saying you should actually do that. Maybe it's something you have to wait until the close of services to address properly. But the point we're getting here in Matthew 5 is that we need to commit to doing our part to resolve conflict. Commit to actively working towards reconciliation, to being a peacemaker, to doing everything within our power to get rid of tension that exists in relationships and reaffirm our love for anyone who might have something to hold against us. That's the heart of Jesus. And we might say, well, yes, but I'm really not the one who's causing the tension in this relationship. I'm not the one who's done something wrong. They're the one who needs to be coming to me. Well, look at Matthew 18. Matthew 18 and verse 15. Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Between you and him alone, if he listens to you, you have gained your brother. Do you notice that? Matthew chapter 5 said, if your brother has something against you, go, drop what you're doing, and go and talk to him. Matthew 18 says, if you have something against your brother, go talk to him. That doesn't give me any room to not reach out and not seek reconciliation. Both parties have a responsibility. If we're the one who has been hurt, or we're the one who has done the hurting, if we're the one who's offended, or if we're the one who has caused the offense, we need to go and talk to them about it. And yet so often the reason we give for not talking to someone is the very reason that God gives that we need to talk to them. I want to encourage us to ingrain something in the culture of this congregation. If anyone ever comes to you talking about, what so-and-so did or what so-and-so said, the first question that we need to ask is, have you talked to them about it? And if the answer is no, then the conversation probably needs to end there. We need to encourage one another to fulfill this, to reach out to those that have wronged us or to those that we may have wronged. And if the conversation does need to continue, maybe you have reached out to them and things still aren't resolved, maybe there's some reason that you feel that you need to reach out for the help or wisdom of someone else. The other question that we need to ask, besides have you talked to them, is what can I do to help? Because that's the goal, right? If it's not the goal, then we shouldn't be having this conversation. Our goal isn't to, go around pointing out the log or the speck in somebody else's eye and talking about it. The goal is to help them get that out of their eye, right? And so however we talk about situations and conflicts and what somebody else has done wrong, that needs to be the goal. That we're trying to genuinely help. And everything we do and everything we say needs to be directed in that way. But we need to talk to that individual. Good communication doesn't happen by talking to Shannon about Grady, or talking to John about Grady, or talking to Mary about Grady. It happens by talking to Grady about Grady. And that's hard. That's uncomfortable. It's unnatural. It's intimidating. It may be awkward. But that's what we need to do to grow. And that's what we need to grow in. Communicate, even when it's hard. In fact, communicate especially when it's hard. And as we think about the importance of communication, how life and death are in the power of the tongue, and we need, especially in conflict, to be fostering relationships and cultivating relationships through reaching out and communicating, we might think that a lesson about communication is primarily going to be about our tongues. But as you look through Proverbs, there's a lot that's said about communication before we even get to our tongues. We need to listen first. Good communication starts with our ears, not with our mouths. James 1 and verse 19 says, "Let each of you be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath." If we want to become a good communicator, we need to focus first on becoming a good listener. Let's look at some Proverbs. Proverbs 18 and verse 13. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Proverbs 21 verse 28, the ESV says, a false witness will perish, but the word of a man who hears will endure. The NIV says, a careful listener will testify successfully. If we want to testify successfully, if we want our words to have value and be appropriate to the situation, be as constructive and helpful as they can be, we're going to have to take some time to be a careful listener first. The effectiveness of our words in any given situation is going to depend greatly on how well and how thoroughly we have first listened to the words of others. It's so easy to respond to what we think someone else is saying, rather than to respond to what they're actually saying. We assume that we understand the heart and the motive behind words or actions of others without taking the time to let them explain where that's coming from and properly understand that. We often think that good communication is being able to finish one another's sentences. But good communication is actually letting others finish their sentences for themselves and taking the time to listen to what they have to say. And before Aaron gets up here and calls me out as a hypocrite for teaching this, let me say, this is something that I struggle with. In fact, every single one of the principles that we're going to talk about is something that I struggle with. I'm not speaking about any of this from a place of success in all of these things. But we need to grow in it. That's what God's word says. We need to grow in it. We need to grow in taking the time to listen. Listening well is part of showing love and selfless consideration for others. If we genuinely love other people around us, we're going to grow in listening to them. Philippians 2 verses 3 and 4. Here, before getting into the example of Jesus in verse 5 as our ultimate example of this heart, this attitude, he says in verse 3 and 4, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." What does that attitude look like in conversation? If I count others more than significant than myself, if I'm looking out for their interest and not simply my own interest, how is that going to look in conversation? Sometimes we have a hard time listening because we are more interested in what's on our mind and what's going on in our life and what we have to contribute to the conversation than what is going on in somebody else's life. What's on their mind and in their heart. We think that what we have to offer is more important or valuable. Every conversation we enter into, we need to enter with the goal of learning more about what's going on in somebody else's life. Seeking out their interests, treating them as more significant. And that doesn't come naturally. That's not what the flesh wants to do. That's hard work. It takes practice. We have to learn how to ask good questions and pay close attention to what someone else is saying. But we need to commit to that. We need to commit to always listen first and speak last. If we want to grow in communication, we first need to grow in being good listeners. And again, before we even get to the speaking part of this, as we think about listening, another principle that Proverbs addresses time and time again in listening is that we need to welcome correction. One area that we may struggle to listen the most is when the topic is something that we need to grow in, something that we're struggling with, or something that we've done wrong. Yet we've already talked about in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 18 the necessity of communication in those situations. Sometimes that's the most important kind of communication that we're going to take part in and maybe be on the receiving end of. There's perhaps no principle in the book of Proverbs that is emphasized more about communication than this one. The importance of accepting, valuing, and welcoming rebuke. In fact, when I was looking through Proverbs, I found over 20 different verses that directly address this idea. Let's just look at 3 of them. Proverbs 12 and verse 1. "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid." Do we love discipline and reproof? Or are we more inclined to hate it, to kick back against it? Proverbs 17 and verse 10. "A rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding than 100 blows into a fool." How deep does correction go into our hearts? Do we welcome it in and let it change us deeply? Or do we repel it at the surface and harden ourselves against it? Proverbs 25 and verse 12, "Like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear." Do we value reproof in that way as gold? Do we see it as a precious gift or an unwelcome intrusion? And these proverbs are not primarily addressed to those people who are giving the rebuke, right? It's addressed to us who are receiving it. I think sometimes we read those and we say, yep, that's how people respond, isn't it? Well, no, we got to take the mirror, we got to turn it back on ourselves and realize, okay, when I'm the one who needs to grow, when I'm the one who's struggling, when there are things that I need to improve, how do I respond to that? Well, one of the most deep biblical principles of wisdom is being open and ready to grow, ready to change, being poor in spirit, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, welcoming in correction. It's really not natural, though, for us to love discipline and welcome correction. Ask a 3-year-old. It's not natural to love that, to enjoy that. We don't like to face our mistakes or admit our failures. It's not enjoyable to see ourselves in that way. And it's even less enjoyable when somebody else is seeing us in that way and communicating that to us. But if we're ever going to grow, we have to learn to welcome correction. We have to be able to see the areas that we're failing before we can start working to change and grow. And so we have to get over the shame and embarrassment of admitting our failures and be real about it. If you ever hear a sermon that steps on your toes, there are 2 ways you can respond to that. I've had people before saying, "Did you preach that sermon about me?" Or I've had people say, "You know what, I really needed to hear that, and I appreciate it." Which one are we? Our service to the Lord isn't about maintaining a self-image of righteousness and maturity. Our service to the Lord is about growing. And so, should we be surprised that there are areas that we need to grow? If there's anybody here who doesn't need to grow, then why are you here, right? That's why we came here, isn't it? Because we need to grow. And so we need to be ready and eager, looking for areas that we need to grow and that we need to change. Is that the kind of heart that we have? Let's resolve to have the attitude of David. In Psalm 141, verse 5, David says, "Let a righteous man strike me. It is a kindness. Let him rebuke me. It is oil for my head. Let my head not refuse it." That doesn't mean rebuke doesn't need to be seasoned with grace. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be given in love and in gentleness and thoughtfulness in the proper context and in the proper way. But as far as me on the receiving end, I need to cultivate the kind of heart that welcomes correction, whether it's thoughtful or not, whether it's done in the proper way or not. I need to kind of have the heart that is seeking to grow. And so maybe we need to pray that prayer of David ourselves. Let the righteous strike me, that I might grow. It is a kindness. And as we start getting to the point that we are communicating with our mouths, before we actually get there, we need to take time to think. Most times our words get us in trouble, not because we have thought long and hard and carefully about what it is we need to say, and in the end we just chose to say the wrong thing. Most times it gets us in trouble when we have blurted something out on the spur of the moment and didn't think it through. Proverbs 15 and verse 28 says, "The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil." Do you see the contrast there? The righteous ponders, the mouth of the wicked pours forth. Which one do we do more of? Do we ponder or do we pour forth? Proverbs 29 and verse 20 says, "Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him." If you've ever read Proverbs and seen all the dreadful things that are said about the fool, this verse should stop us in our tracks. That there is more hope for the fool than for the one who is hasty in his words. Being hasty in word doesn't just make us a fool, it makes us worse than a fool. And so, as James 1:19 says, we need to be slow to speak and quick to hear. And this is especially the case when there is conflict. When emotions are high, it's tempting to want to fire back a response. Society tells us that there's a lot more power in a quick comeback that has more force and effectiveness than a well thought out, kind of even-tempered response. But that's a lie. Quick comebacks do a lot more to stir up the pot and deepen rifts between people rather than help to resolve conflict. They may feel really good in the moment, feel like they said exactly what we wanted to say and got them good, but that does not accomplish God's will. That does not accomplish God's purpose. It has a lot more force to divide, a lot more force to push people away. The words that heal and build up are those that are well thought out and carefully stated. Proverbs 26, verse 20 and 21 says, "For lack of wood the fire goes out, and where there is no whisperer, quarrels cease. As charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife." Yeah, you might have heard the phrase, strike while the iron is hot, right? That may be good advice in metallurgy and business ventures, but it's not wise advice in conflict. Let the fire die down. Wait until emotions are able to subside and you have your spirit under control before you speak. And yes, we need to communicate in conflict. We're not saying don't communicate. That was our first point. We need to communicate. But sometimes good communication takes time. Time to think. Time to pray, which we'll talk about in our next lesson. Time to make sure that our words are governed by wisdom and not simply by emotion. James 1, verse 19, as we said earlier, says, "Let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." James 1, verse 26, "If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, that person's religion is useless." Do you see that picture of bridling our tongue? The tongue has great power. It has great power for life and great power for death. It's not inherently a bad thing, but that power must be restrained with wisdom. It can't just be let loose. It has to be gently and slowly guided in the right direction. James, in James chapter 3, uses the illustration of a rudder on a ship, or a bit in a horse's mouth, or a fire. All of those things are valuable things. They are powerful things. A ship, a horse, a fire. And they have a proper use and a proper context, but if you let them loose, a ship can do great damage running into a bridge, or a horse can do great damage trampling over things. Fire can do great damage as it spreads. And so the value of those things, the value of the tongue, is found when it is restrained, when it is bridled, when it's brought into check, when we've taken time to think about what it is we're saying, and it is governed by wisdom, not by simply emotion. And fifth, I guess we really haven't gotten to talking about the proper use of our tongues much at all today. We'll get to that next time. But fifth, know when to be quiet. Taking time to ponder instead of pour forth at times may help us realize that we're better off staying silent. Proverbs 11 and verse 12 says, "Whoever belittles his neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding remains silent." Proverbs 17, verse 27 and 28, "Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent." Proverbs 29 and verse 11, "A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back." Think about that last passage in particular. A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. We often talk about venting our feelings. It's easy when our emotions are stirred up to want to pour forth our thoughts to someone else, to complain or to gossip or to just let loose. And from the perspective of worldly wisdom, there's great value in that, right? You have all that pent-up emotion and you just need to let it loose. You need to speak about it and kind of get it off your chest. And it's valuable from a worldly perspective because it makes us feel better, right? Venting my emotions, once I'm done doing that, that felt pretty good. But that's not the goal within itself, right? Because I might, in that process of venting my feelings, be doing a lot more damage, even though I made myself feel better. If I haven't been governing that by wisdom, that's going to do a lot more damage than good. While communicating about our feelings and our struggles with others is very important, there is never a time where that doesn't still need to be governed by wisdom. We need to be communicating to the right people in the right way at the right time. And there are times when that vent is blowing in the wrong direction, and we just need to close it off, because that's going to do damage. That's not as God intends it to be. If I ever find myself tired of holding onto the reins of my tongue and wanting to just kind of let it run free, let it say what it wants to say, I need to go and lock the pony up in the stall and wait until another time to get it out, right? Never can I be tired of holding back the reins of my tongue and just kind of let go of the reins. There was a situation back in Lincoln, Nebraska when I was growing up where we had some friends who had horses, and they had a bunch of young people out there to ride the horses. And I was one of the last ones to ride this horse in a long line of kids. So the horse was kind of tired, and sweaty, and I felt bad for it. And so I stopped, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to let this horse take a break while I'm sitting here, and I'll let him eat a little bit of grass. And so I kind of reached down the reins so he could get to the grass, and that wasn't very comfortable. And so I just kind of set the reins right there and stepped back. That was a dumb idea. Very quickly, the horse realized that I wasn't in control, and it took off. And the owner is yelling, grab the reins, grab the reins. Never is there a time with our tongue that we can just let go of the reins. Because that's the moment where it's going to do damage. And there are just some things that don't need to be said. It doesn't matter how much time I've thought about it. That's not something that needs to come out of my mouth. We'll talk about some more principles next week that will help us in making those decisions. But for now, let's say this. If what I'm saying is ever focused solely on my feelings and how it makes, how saying this is going to make me feel, and not focused in any way on what is going to genuinely benefit those around me, those who are hearing it, not focused on what is going to fulfill God's purpose in my life, then I need to take that to God and leave it with Him and not take it anywhere else. I think I've exceeded my 6,000 words for today. But I pray that they've all been to the glory of God, and that they'll be a benefit to you. So what about us? Death and life are in the power of the tongue. And that shouldn't just motivate us to want to run away from it. That should motivate us to give proper attention and respect to its power in our lives. It should motivate us to work on it. Proverbs says, those who love it will eat its fruit. Let's love our tongues like a special garden that we have and that we're able to work in to cultivate the good fruit that God intends to grow there each day. Let's commit to being better communicators so that our tongues can bear the fruit of life. And so, brother, James says that if somebody is able to bridle their tongue, that they're a perfect man able to bridle the whole body. What we've talked about today is something that we all need to grow in. It's something that is difficult. It is something that I'm going to fail in. And when I do fail in it, I hope that you will have the love and concern for me to help me through that, to be patient with me in that, and I welcome that. But we need to help one another in that. Let's make sure that our words are directed always towards helping one another grow. And that may involve correction, that may involve rebuke, right? But we need to make sure that both in our ears and in our mouth, we're allowing the Lord to be the one who's governing that. Not how I feel in the moment, not worldly wisdom, but that we're allowing God to cultivate the kind of fruit that He intends through our communication with one another. So what about you today? Is there some area that you need to grow? Maybe there's somebody that you need to reach out to, somebody that you need to make something right with. Won't you do that? The only way that relationships grow is by us communicating with one another. And God intends that we have strong relationships as a body, as a family, as a flock. Even in our communication with those outside, God intends that we be shining the light of His character in that. If you recognize that there's some area that you need to change, won't you make that change today? If you need help in making that change, won't you reach out to somebody? And if it's of a public nature, that you need to ask for the prayers of these brethren, ask for the forgiveness of these brethren, we're going to offer you that opportunity now. And if you've never committed your life to the Lord, by God's grace, you have an opportunity that you can bury your old life in the waters of baptism. You can be raised to walk in newness of life. Do you believe in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, that He died and rose again for your sins? Are you ready to leave your old life behind, to confess your faith, to wash away your sins in the waters of baptism? If you need to do that today, won't you make that commitment? If we can help you in any way, won't you please come forward as we stand and sing together?